A warm welcome to everyone. We're here to talk about building bridges between central government and local government. My name's Andrew Laird and I'm the Managing Director of Mutual Ventures. We're a small consultancy that works with the central government, works with councils, the NHS and the third sector. And we spend quite a lot of time on what we're going to be talking about today, which is the bridge between the central and local and making that connection. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Emily Miles, who's the Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency and previous holder of a range of very senior central government positions, and also Paul Morrison, who is the Director of Planning Transformation at the Department for Levelling Up, but is doing a very different, very specific and very important role right now, which he will talk to us about, but means he has to leave quite early, unfortunately. But I think when Paul explains that, you will completely understand. I'm also joined by my colleague, John Copps, who has led a number of our central government programs, which involve creating a connection between central government and local government. We'll hear from Emily and Paul in a bit. And then I'll give a brief overview of a report which we have developed on the lessons learned between building effective bridges between central and local. So just before we start, a couple of house rules. You can submit questions via the Q&A function and we will do our best to get to them. Emily and Paul, I don't think have slides. I have a few. I will share them afterwards. And we're also recording this, so you will be able to watch it again if you so wish, or share with any colleagues. Before we start, I just want to say one quick word on the importance of a good bridge. So the pandemic over the past couple of years has really shown how important this is, how important the relationship between central and local, and also those institutions which sit in between. Bridges between central government and local are important for business as usual activities, but they're also really important for specific programs. And it has been a while since we've had a run of the central government programs, but now with a spending review last year and a levelling up white paper, which will spawn additional white papers, I think we will now start to see central government programs coming through. And my final point, just before handing over to Paul, is just that bridges are about people, not systems and processes. So the bridge is about people on both sides, on the central government side, on the local government side, are real people. And indeed on the bridge itself are real people as well. So I think as we listen to what Emily and Paul have to say, it's just bearing in mind that no amount of process will get around the fact that this is about relationships between real people. So with that, Paul, I'd love to bring you in now, and I know that you only have a short amount of time to spend with us, but over to you.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Can I check you can hear me all right?
I can hear you, yeah.
Very good. So it's really lovely to be here, and particularly lovely to be here with my colleague and friend, Emily, who we've worked a long time over the years. And it's really lovely to see all of you. So Andrew has trailed it. The reason I'm here briefly is that I am very heavily involved in the Homes for Ukraine scheme program that you may have heard around, which it could not be in many ways a more archetypal program requiring bridges, not just bridges between central and local, but also the human bridges between all of the people who are going to be under this scheme hosting Ukrainians in their homes. And just to frame that, part of the reason I'm here and doing this now is because I was also in a previous role. I was responsible for helping establish the Syrian resettlement program, you may remember from a few years back, and that had a component in it of something called community sponsorship, where communities come together and provide support and integration to refugees in their communities. My background, I'm a career civil servant, but if I was to say I'm a career civil servant, it's my passion in delivering public services is about how we can come together collectively to deliver the challenges that we face. Now, perhaps I'm going to take a step back and not go deeply into the Ukrainian one. It's kind of in flight, it's live, but just maybe to reflect on the Syrian example, which I gave previously, where When it first started, I was in the Home Office. I was given a responsibility on one level that in this Parliament we're going to have 20,000 Syrian refugees drawn out of the war zone, areas around the war zone, and to the United Kingdom. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because in thinking about being the bridge builder that Andrew talks about, there are some really big choices you make around how you deal with that kind of a challenge. So for example, there was one level in which I could have addressed it, which might be a traditional, more logistical command and control level, which was really just focused on how you move people from one place to another place. But actually the beauty of that was that I had a team which was joint across government. So I had colleagues from what was then DFID, the development department with an international focus. I had colleagues from what was then called, I think it was called MHCLG. It goes through a number of changes, DLUC now, and the Home Office. But really crucially, from the first moment I started thinking about it, what I was thinking about was a problem which wasn't just moving people. It was moving, yes, of course, it was taking people to a place of safety, but it was focused both on their well-being and of the communities that hosted them. And from taking that initial view, and then just my first meeting as I set it up, of course, I had the local government association in the call. They were part of the, it's not a command and control structure, but it was a group of people immediately working together because, of course, and I'm sure there may well be people on this call who are involved both in Ukraine and on the Syrian program. The reason I say it is, without even thinking about it, I now realize in retrospect, partly from having conversations with people like you, Andrew, that what I was doing was automatically stepping into the bridge builder role. And sometimes you need to reflect on what you've done, because then you start thinking, okay, so that's not necessarily a capability that I've always used and exercised. And I think there's something for us about thinking and being deliberate about it. And the last, few reflections I might give on it, and I'm thinking about it a lot at the moment, is there are some things we just fall into. And I think part of being a good bridge builder is really the ability to put yourself in the shoes of all of the other people you're working with, not just empathy, but compassion in the way that you deal with people, and really critically curiosity. And if you do adopt those models, there are some very different behaviors that you will adopt. So for example, there's something in central government, it's probably the same across the piece, where you talk around what we really need to do is get better at engagement. And when you pull away the surface of that, what people mean by engagement is we need to get in a room full of people and tell them stuff, tell them what we think. It's not real engagement. Engagement really needs to be about a collaborative, like as I think about it now, what's the problem here? How are we going to relocate 20,000 people to 300 local authorities right across the United Kingdom and all the complications? So the engagement needed to be that dialogue. I am completely sold on co-production being the best. I'm completely sold on co-production being the best, and in a kind of geographically dispersed way, because central government is a long way from anywhere. It's distant, and you don't know the ground truth necessarily very often, just because of where you are positioned, and organizationally as much as physically. I think there is something that I would reflect on, Andrew, around just thinking around not allowing your position in an organization to start dictating behavior. So of course, in our system of government, you have central government which sets budgets, and local government which is in receipt of funding and of law that's set at a national level. And I just reflect quite often that can easily translate into a kind of a parent-child transaction. And going to my earlier conversation and thinking about being a bridge builder, that doesn't work for anyone really, because it has to be, yes, we are adopting different positions, but to be a bridge builder, we have to have a conversation of equals based on that position of curiosity and compassion that I'm talking about, and really being in it together. And then the last thing I would leave and just finish my comments, and then I'll listen to a bit of the next bit, and then I will have to disappear. And I really don't want to, Andrew. I really want to stay here and have this discussion because you're here. That it's something I'm passionate about. But the reflection I've had is that we need to recognise the systems we work in. And I don't know who's on the call. Some of us will be in central government, some of us will be in local government. A lot of us will be working in bureaucracies, and bureaucracies love order, and they love structure, and to an extent they love control, and sometimes they enjoy centralization. And really, I think part of the bridge building is building a bridge of trust where we can collaborate, and that, in a funny sort of way, means that we have to be quite bad bureaucrats and get out there and devolve it. And sometimes it means different things will happen in different places, and it won't be all as neat as the pen pusher in me would like. But I just leave us with that thought, because I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves around being the bridge builder, there are things that we need to be conscious of that might stop us from doing that. So I know that's a bit of a, and you can, I hope people will understand why it is that I'm limited in my contribution, but I hope I've thrown some thoughts in that are helpful and you can chew over.
You certainly have, Paul. Do you have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions? Brilliant. So I mean, Emily and John might have a few questions as well, but my question, I think, is from your experience on the Syrian program to the experience now on the Ukrainian program, are there any kind of key things that you learned from the first experience that you thought, right, well, I'm definitely going to do that this way this time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have certainly learned an awful lot. I think I have done the things I've been capable of better as a consequence of it. I almost need a session, Andrew, to really reflect on it. I could, I think quite a lot of it is the, I tell you what it is, Andrew. I have been able to be an advocate for the way of engagement that I'm talking about, and I'm not. And there'll be people on this call who will be saying, "Well, he doesn't seem to be doing a very good job at that because there's still X, Y, and Z happening." But I have clear in my mind that I know it works. I know if you trust people, I know if you engage, I know if you bring people in, I know it works. And so I have been able to bring that degree of confidence into the exchanges that, if we do that, good things can happen.
Very good. John?
Paul, I was struck by your comment on a bridge builder being a bad bureaucrat. And I wonder what you think central government can do, for example, to make civil servants, make it easier for them to be bridge builders.
Yes. And as I said, the bad bureaucrat thing, I thought that's going to stick. And let me just say, before I get hauled in front of a PAC and declare myself a bad bureaucrat, I do believe we need structure and a degree of order, and you need to define your. In a sense, what I'm saying is you need defined areas of the ambiguity that you work together in complexity, and I think there is a job for us to create that space. And how can the civil service be? Well, one of the reasons Andrew and I is connected was because I'm trying to work with the Civil Service Modernisation and Reform Programme about how we do this. The tricky bit, John, is that as I think it's as Andrew said, so often when we have ask ourselves this question, we focus on how the structures can change to make it happen. Let's set up this kind of bit of governance and this bit of task force. The thing that I think is a growing understanding by a lot of people, including Emily on this call, who's a senior colleague, is about that need for us to really invest in the human interaction and the trust, and that is a thing that we have to do, and we have to do it deliberately. And so I think us accepting that as a thing and then thinking about doing it and not just expecting it to happen in some amorphous osmosis, if we all talk about it enough, it happens. I think that's what we have to commit to.
Very good. Last question. Are you dealing with the same people largely this time as you did the last time? Because it's usually the central government person that changes. And you're there.
To tell you what, Andrew, one of the most awesome things about this is that I've been I've been away from this world I spent a year working for Emily in the Food Standards Agency, and then I've spent a while now in the planning reform job. But as soon as I came back, all those people were there, all of the relationships, all of the trust with so many of them, and I suddenly, I think, appreciated what an asset that is. We don't it is worth as much to the program for me personally as me being given a £5 million budget, because you just have it all there already, and I hope we can maintain it through that, and the relationships of trust sustain. They certainly feel on a personal level as if they are. So yes, that's a really good question.
Paul, thank you so much, and I'm going to let you go now, but I really appreciate you said before we started that you didn't want to let me down, and I really appreciate it, because it would have been very easy to not do this, but I think it's so important that people learn as well, and I know that you really value that. So thank you for sharing, and all the best of luck from all of us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks Paul.
Bye everyone.
Thank you very much. Wow, that was fantastic. So good to hear from Paul, and Emily, I'm so grateful to you as well for making time. This is the second time that you've made time for me. You were on my Radical Reformers podcast and we had a fantastic discussion. So I'm so grateful, and I know that you also appreciate the importance of making time to share your experience and your ideas with others. So I'd love to invite you to say a few words now.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and really nice to see Paul again. We worked together a couple of times in my career. And just to say a bit about me, I've worked in central government for 22 years. The last 2.5 I've been in the Food Standards Agency. I spent some time in DEFRA, but I've also spent about 15 years doing home affairs, so policing, immigration, and things in that neck of the woods. And for some of that, 3 years I was in Downing Street quite early on in my career. And that my experience of working in Downing Street led me to want to work closer to the front line, because I had this experience of sitting in the centre and feeling like I wanted something to happen, and I couldn't work out how to make it happen. So I thought if I go and work, I ended up working in immigration in a case working directorate. If I went and worked there, then I would really be making things happen. And I discovered in that journey that also being a senior leader in a frontline organisation requires lots and lots of thinking about change and in terms of making things happen. So I've seen a bit of both ends of that. I wanted to start by just bringing in a reflection about the UK and particularly England as a country. I was lucky enough to be at a seminar recently where Philip McCann, who's an author, talked to us. It was a group of senior leaders in government on the theme of levelling up. And he's written a book. It's called The UK Regional National Economic Problem, which I haven't read, but he told us the headline, so I feel like I've read it. And he basically said that UK regional economic problems are very unusual, that our dominant capital city region and the trade routes are concentrated into one regional area in the UK, so they all come into London. That's very unusual in a state. And the UK has one of the most top-down centralised government systems in the world. He was saying that the governance problem that he sees is that at the bottom you've got local citizens, local authorities, but at the top you've got these big players, so central government and big companies, and they block access. So he talks about the UK having tremendous expertise at the top, but no knowledge about what is going on locally in the centre. And there's a big gap. So the people at the bottom of the pyramid don't bother engaging because they can't get access to the people who've got a lot of power, but not very much knowledge at the centre of the pyramid. And he was saying that his argument for levelling up and devolution was there's two ways of tackling the governance problem. You can either be small and as a country and minimise the degrees of separation between the top and the bottom, so Ireland or the Baltics or the Nordics have that, or you decentralise and you federalise like Germany or Canada or the US, so that day by day, week by week, decisions are taken at a city, state or regional level. And he reckoned the average size of a meaningful region was about 3 to 5 million people, which is sort of Greater Manchester or Scotland size. So I wanted to say that at the start, because I think we all have to recognise that in England, there is a particular challenge about having a very centralised government and insufficient, probably, responsibility at the right scale in local authorities. And I'm not necessarily prescribing that we all need to devolve immediately, but I think we need to think about the bridge in that context with those particular characteristics. So my experience of working in central government is that what tends to happen, and there's 3 problems that I was thinking about earlier that I'd share with you. The first is that we tend to operate in a silo. So I think about food because I'm at the Food Standards Agency. When I was doing policing, and I was in charge of the policing directorate in the Home Office, I thought about policing. And the same thing goes with all sorts of other, whether it's further education, money, or it's health, we tend to think in those subject silos. The second issue is the one that the academic I was talking about, Philip McCann, names, which is what I call we operate with top level done. So those of us in the centre, those of us in government don't have familiarity with some of the systems at play. We can see a broad picture, but we don't know the detail. And the example for me recently I heard a cabinet minister say, I won't tell you which one, say in a meeting, well, we just need to tell the county councils and they'll tell the district councils what to do. And I thought, oh, I don't think she really understands how local government is organised in this country. So that top level done can happen. The third is, I think the rhythms operate very differently. And in central government, what tends to happen is either it's glacial and nothing happens at all because there's no political interest happening in it, or it's incredibly fast because there's a lot of political interest and things are moving quickly. And that you've got those two paces. We don't have a pace in the middle. Whereas I think in local authority world or police force world or whatever, it's much more delivery based, and I've worked in the delivery organisation. You set what you're doing, you move relatively steadily towards a thing. So just to give you some examples of those. So first of all, in a silo, I talked about this on the podcast that we did, Andrew, but when I was working in immigration, I was responsible for clearing the asylum backlog. And we had in our backlog caseload lots and lots of asylum seeking families who'd been on the immigration department's books for often 10 to 15 years. They were quite expensive because we were paying for their accommodation. So I was being asked by my organisation to get through that caseload really quickly. And most of them qualified to stay in the UK. They were getting indefinite leave to remain. As soon as we granted them indefinite leave to remain, we were able to take them off our books, and then they rocked up to the local authority as homeless families needing housing. And I didn't realise or think through the consequences of what I was doing for the local authority until there started being some local authorities saying, hold on a minute, what are you up to? You can't possibly handle this. So we had to very rapidly stop working in a silo. So that's one example. I think top level done, another, well, maybe I won't go into too much detail because we could pick this up in conversation, but often I found as a policymaker in Downing Street, or I was strategy director in DEFRA for a while, or when I was policing director, you tend to have a hypothesis that makes sense to you as intuitively as someone who doesn't know much. And actually, when you go and inquire and find out what things are really like on the ground, that hypothesis doesn't stand the test of time. So the top level done, it's like, well, surely this should work. The one that's on my mind at the moment is about school food, because the Food Standards Agency has just been asked to help think through how the local environmental health inspectors might be used to test whether school food standards are being followed, because they're going into the canteens. And on the face of it, it sounds like a fantastic idea. When you start digging underneath it and thinking it through, there's all sorts of challenges and issues. So you have to, that's a challenge. And then the third one about being out of sync. If I give an example from the food world, whenever I talk to a local authority environmental health team, they're always very interested in simpler ways of doing enforcement with businesses. Why don't we have fixed penalty notices for instead of quite long prosecutions for food law breaches? It's a perfectly sensible idea. I think it would make much more sense. But there is no political appetite at all to do that. So it's just operating at a glacial pace, a sort of sensible thing that's just no policy window to work through. And as an example in the other direction, all the things that were going on with the pandemic and schools, where there were kind of new policies coming out every 5 minutes about what to do about social distancing or new curricula or whatever, and schools are having to cope with that kind of, literally we've had 30 notices this week that we have to absorb into the local authority and work out how to apply. That kind of pace is very intense too. So there's those two paces that become difficult. And so the question for me then is, how do you mitigate those challenges in the context that we're in, which is relatively centralized, top level done, risks? The first is really one about that Paul was saying about relationships and it being good to talk. I know I've heard people from local areas or from stakeholder groups say over and over again, it's so frustrating. The person that we're relating to in central government has moved on. We're having to start again and explain it all again. Do you have that sense of having to re-educate the new person who's new and doesn't understand it? I just would make a plea that it's worth it. And although you're having to reinvest and recreate those relationships from time to time, it's worth it because you get to be more influential. And if you're able to convey your perspective and your worldview and educate that series of people, although it may not, it will make a difference right now to the thing they're working on right now, but it also will make a difference later when they are doing things like what I'm doing now, running an organisation and thinking about their own misconceptions, learning that they had misconceptions and that they needed correcting. And the same thing goes for dealing with the silo. And then the second thing I think it's worth being aware of is there is this idea, I think it's a useful concept, which is the policy window being open or closed. So what tends to happen in government is not much changes, everything's quite static. And then suddenly there's a political moment where things open and you can change the rules or you can change the approach. Sometimes those moments are caused by general elections and manifestos. Sometimes they're caused by a crisis. Sometimes they're caused by a new Secretary of State coming in who's got a different agenda to the previous one. But so you basically need to be it's very useful to know when the window is open, because you can start firing your ideas and your approaches and your analysis through it to the people who are trying to come up with the new white paper or the new approach or whatever. It's quite difficult to be firing that stuff through when the window is closed. And that can, I think, feel like government is just impervious. So you'll often get things like, funding formulas that don't work, and you can see year after year after year that it's not really working. But the window just isn't open. It's too complicated for the Whitehall department to deal with it. We certainly had that on police funding. It's like there'll be winners and losers. We know it's not perfect. We're going to live with it. Was where we were on police funding in the late 2000s. So or 2010s. So being conscious of that window being open or closed. And then if you really, really want it to open when it's closed, what you need to do is build a coalition to get it open. So you're going to need your local MP, you're going to need some NGOs, you're going to need probably some good evidence to make the case that the thing needs changing. And I'm very happy to talk about how one might do that. So in sum, what I'm saying is the challenge is an over-centralised state, top level dumb as a issue for those of us working in central government, and then these silo working and different rhythms. The solutions are relationships, taking the time to educate each other about your perspectives, and then being conscious of when the timing is right for change.
Great. Emily, thank you so much. I just, before I present some of the findings from our report, I just wanted to ask you a few things. You've said the word relationships a lot there, and it's clear that humans are at the center of all this, and those relationships are really important. And I think for maybe some of the people listening, there is that need that you talked about to constantly create new relationships as people move around. And that's why I was so really surprised and delighted when Paul was saying that he was coming back to do this job and it was the same people on the other side, and he was able to rekindle some of those relationships. But at that point about just, you have to put the effort in. If it's a new person, fine, put the effort in. My question for you is about the structural stuff versus the human stuff. So in our experience, John and mine's experience, the really good central government civil servants, or at least a lot of the ones that we've dealt with, have some experience of working at local level as well. And is that more important than the scale, or is it a bit of both, or because of the system we're in, is it just always going to be really difficult no matter how talented and how knowledgeable you are about both sides of the bridge?
What did you say? Was that more important than the scale, did you say?
Than the scale. So, we were saying, you were saying the right level being 3 to 5 million. Obviously, the UK or England, it's a lot bigger than that. I mean, that's an academic's view about what the right level is. I don't, in a way, I thought it was just very interesting that was the piece. The reason why he's saying that is because in that level you can get the relationships working. He's basically saying there aren't too many steps from the person at the front line to the person at the centre. So if we haven't got that, then we need to think really carefully about the relationships and how we build them. So I mean, just to take the example of the Food Standards Agency, we have a unit called the Regulatory Compliance Division that relates to local authorities, and perhaps people will know that the FSA sets the expectations about what food hygiene inspections should happen and what should happen on food standards, and we set out what's a risky business and what's not, and then what frequency of interventions would need to happen with that business.
And then we support local authorities who actually have to do that work themselves and have the legal responsibility to do it. So we absolutely need to know what's happening at ground level. What we have is both formal and informal arrangements. So a lot of the regulatory compliance division staff and indeed the similar teams in Wales and Northern Ireland will have had a background in environmental health or trading standards. So they've worked in a local authority often for 10, 15 years, and then they might be working in the FSA. So there is a knowledge about how things work. We then also have something called FSA Smarter Communications, which is a platform which allows communication and resource sharing. We have twice a week, we send updates to local authorities. There's resources like forms and templates and toolkits and guidance that's on that platform. And then we also have a dedicated team that does the engagement with local authorities. So we don't just rely on that platform, Smarter Communications, we also share information intelligence more directly. And then we meet with local authorities in England at least once a quarter through the local authority food working groups. And we've got separate teams who do the same thing in Wales and Northern Ireland. So you can see there's a bit of the formality, regular quarterly meetings. There's also the informal, there's the relationships. And what I certainly find that I get given good advice from our regulatory compliance division about what's happening in different parts of the country because of that regular contact, and it's very, very important.
Great, thank you. John, did you want to come in with a few thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the skills of a bridge builder and what that actually means. So one thing to pick on that Emily said was around, I mean, to caricature it, I think in large part central government doesn't really understand local government, and local government doesn't really understand central government. And maybe we'll get onto this, but is there anything we can do about that? And then my second point is around, I think we talk about relationships and it makes it sound like we want everything to be harmonious, but actually it's really important, I think, to have a tension between central government and local government. And I think there's such thing as a healthy tension, which perhaps some of those examples that Paul and Emily have talked about, and then an unhealthy tension. And maybe an example of that is early in the COVID crisis when directors of public health felt like they were out of the loop when all and I just think the question then becomes, what level of tension, or what does that tension look like to be most productive?
What's a tolerable amount of tension and what's the right sort of tension? Emily, do you want to respond briefly to that? Thanks, John. Or you can ponder on it for
well, I'm just thinking, I'm going to give you a bit of theory and then an observation. So I don't know if people have come across the adaptive leadership work that Ronald Heifetz wrote, and in it he talks about when you're trying to make change happen, you need to, and in fact it may not be his book, it may be the Immunity to Change book, I may be confusing them, which is by Lisa Leahy and someone else. But they talk about the zone of disequilibrium, where you need to turn the heat up on a situation so that change is going to happen, but you mustn't turn it up too high, otherwise the immune system kicks back and basically chucks you out and doesn't want change to happen. It sort of reverts to the mean or reverts to the norm. So I think there is, as you say, John, there's a sort of unhealthy and healthy. If I think about the COVID, and I was very much a sideline observer for most of the pandemic and watching what was going on between the centre and different areas, the bit that looked to me like it didn't really work was that bit in autumn 2020, when the government was trying to take a regional by regional approach. There was a sort of standoffs happening between the Greater Manchester Mayor and the Cabinet Office, and people were talking about information not being shared and judgments being brought, and that felt like it was unhealthy and quite political, and we got to a very different place after that, didn't we? And certainly in England, which was more about a kind of one size fits all approach. In terms of it working well, I think it goes back in a way to relationships at the most senior level. So the difficulties if you have secretaries of state who aren't engaging regularly in understanding the world from those local perspectives. And so then they're making a lot of assumptions. But if that regular engagement does happen, it usually massively improves the policy making, because the kind of ground level awareness is better.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Right, I'm going to just share my screen. John, would you just give me a thumbs up to say if you can see that properly?
I can see something, but it's not. It's not
okay.
yet.
Let me try again. This has happened to me a couple of times this week, actually. How about that? Yeah, brilliant. Right. Okay. So last year we did some analysis to draw out the key learnings that we had found from our work in supporting the delivery of central government programs locally. These are programs like the Department for Education's Innovation Program in Social Care, the Regional Adoption Agency Program, and the Strengthening Families Program, as well as other programs like the Mutual Support Program, which was a DCMS agenda that was supporting local groups of public service staff to spin out into mutuals and social enterprises. So very much on that bridge. And that's the bridge. So on one side, you've got Westminster. On the other side, you've got the town hall. And that bridge is so important. And some of the key things that we found from our work and from talking to people that they really valued about the bridge is the fact that you can build trust. So remember, I said that this was all about people. So on that bridge, you have people. Now that might be people like Emily who are in government bodies, but not within central government. So the Food Standards Agency supports the implementation of central government policy, but also supports councils to do their job. It could be people like us, John and I, who are consultants and support central government in terms of delivering programs locally. And we can play a role in building trust. And also, it's quite important for that bridge to have a separation between support and making decisions. So quite often central government will have to make tough decisions about who gets funding and who doesn't, or make a judgment on how well a program is being implemented locally. It's quite difficult to do that and then at the same time be an independent person providing advice, support and guidance. So that bridge is important there as well. And it's also creating a safe space for the same reason that you need, if you're involved in a central government program at a local level and have a challenge, it can be quite difficult to go all the way to the powers that be in Westminster to say, we're having a problem here, because that might not be something that you want to do. You may have a fear of losing funding. Whereas if you can go to somebody on the bridge who is a trusted partner, then that is a safe space. And the final bit there I would just pick out is the last point around capturing learning. So that's something that central government almost always puts in the bridge bit of its programs, where it's providing funding support to all different parts of the country. They're all going to learn different lessons. And actually, if central government is funding a pilot of something, it really wants to learn those lessons so that if something is rolled out more broadly, that the lessons which are learned are indeed captured and the mistakes aren't repeated everywhere else. So just in terms of the skills and qualities which make a good bridge builder, I'm not going to go through all of these, and just as a reminder, this information is all in the full report, which I will send to everybody after this, but there's a few bits here. So if we think of the bridge builder as a person, that first point about strong relationship building skills, both Emily and Paul have both emphasized that. The point about having knowledge of central and local government, John in particular mentioned that earlier, that quite often central government doesn't understand local government and vice versa. and I'll talk about this in a second, but it is really important to understand the different pressures, the different constraints which are on both. And if we move over to the other side, patience and listening skills is so important. And I can only imagine what Paul is going through at the minute, trying to deal with 300 councils at the same time, trying to get agreement on things. And I know for a fact that Paul is somebody who is very patient and has great listening skills, but that must be exhausting. But it is so important to have that. And then likewise, the last point there around resilience, very, very important. There is that tension that John talked about, and Emily very much agreed with. And that tension, it will boil over at times, and it's quite difficult to keep it simmering at just the right level. When it boils over every now and again, you've got to have that resilience to stay calm, stay patient, to try and get it back down to gently simmering rather than aggressively boiling, I would say. And then just the final thing I wanted to say, and there's a lot more detail in the report about this, because we wanted it to be a tool that's useful for people who want to understand what central government is and how it operates and how local government operates. But looking at the dimensions there, if you consider, and I'll pick out a few of them, the political dimension, in the central government, ministers are in charge and are accountable to the Prime Minister, to Parliament, to Cabinet. At the local level, there's also politics. There absolutely is also politics, but these are elected members and they're accountable to their own cabinet and also full council. On the finances, the budgets in central government are often set by, well, I say often, on a multi-year period. Over the past couple of years, up until this year, it's been 1-year settlements, but now we have a 3-year settlement, whereas at a local level, the councils for a number of years now have just had 1-year settlements. So it's quite difficult to kind of, particularly if you're central government trying to implement a multi-year program when councils are trying to operate on a single year budget. So that was all I was going to say on that. The report is on our website. I will send the link to everybody after this, but there's lots of good learning in there which is readily available, which if you really want to understand both sides of the bridge, then it is a useful thing to do. So I want to turn to some questions now. So just picking one out here from Roland Pyle. Are the devolution deals heralded in the Levelling Up white paper likely to create more bridges between central and local government? I hope so. Emily or John, do you want to come in on that? I mean, so there is an argument here that it creates two bridges rather than a single bridge. So I think it's a fair question. John, do you want to come in?
Well, I think devolution and more widely levelling up is entirely dependent on a well-functioning bridge between central and local government. And actually, come to think of it, the Department of Levelling Up has just published has just gone out for levelling up directors for each of the regions. And if you read that job description, which was only published yesterday, I think, I posted it on our Mutual Ventures Twitter feed, that reads like a bridge builder. You need someone who can stand up to government, but also do that translation role to local government and be a champion for local areas. And I think devolution needs the same set of skills, and it needs. So we've seen successful mayors on both sides of the political divide standing up for their local areas, and I think hopefully devolution deals will have more of that, and we'll have more of that, and more of those people. Because I think the successful mayors are the ones who can kind of walk that tightrope and are bridge builders.
Yeah, Emily.
So I think the devolution deals are quite radical. Basically, I think they're going after a nirvana that government has been trying to do for certainly almost the entire time I've been in government, which is to try and operate from more of a place-based approach. And if I think about the end of the Labour era, when Labour, in its slightly top-down controlling way, was doing local area agreements, and then there was this concept of total place and that sort of. There have been efforts over time to try and get central government to think in a more place-based way to what's happening in the local area. The devolution deals force central government to think in that way. So I was in Liverpool last week, for instance, where there's a mayor, and the Liverpool Food Alliance is doing some really interesting things across Liverpool to about food, basically access to good, healthy, sustainable food, which is touching all sorts of different parts of central government responsibilities. It includes work on planning and welfare and so on. But because it's being thought of in a place-based way, in a community-based way, it's almost quite confronting to the very siloed approach that we tend to take in central government. So I don't know that I have an answer to whether there's going to be more bridges, but I do think that it is going to force government to join up better and hopefully improve the way we in central government do things.
Thank you. Emily, and I know you've given some examples here, but just if there's anything else you want to say on examples of that bridge where it's worked really well and maybe even some where it hasn't worked so well, because I know you've had a lot of experience of it.
I always feel like I haven't, like this, I've got so much to learn, there's so many different parts of government, isn't there? I mean, so I think, so I mean, if I another shout out for the Police Standards Agency, I think in the pandemic, because we had the bridge in place, we had relationships between local authorities and the FSA. If I think about what was happening in the first couple of months after lockdown, we knew, because we were hearing very rapidly, that that hospitality was closed and that the food hygiene interventions that were expected couldn't be delivered, and that environmental health staff were being diverted onto some quite other jobs that were much more pressing for the local authority. So within quite a short period of time for us, probably not for the local authority, but for the FSA, it's quite a short period of time, like 2 or 3 months, we had regrouped, thought about what our priorities were, agreed with the board a different approach to how to prioritise interventions over the next period. And then last year, so a year later, we did a recovery plan, which I think is quite thoughtful about the local authority resourcing situation. It holds on to the expectation of strong food hygiene standards, but gives some leeway about the interventions plan that we had set before. Now that was heavily informed by our skilled and thoughtful people in our own team who'd got experience of working in local authorities, but also by the relationships and conversations that they had. So and although no one likes an intervention plan from the Food Standards Agency particularly, I think that what we've done is pretty proportionate and sensible and risk-based, and we are seeing is getting local authorities slowly back on track at the moment. So I'd state that as an example. The other one, just going back much longer ago, which I think is quite an interesting one, is I don't know if you remember, in the 2000s, when I was in Downing Street and then in Cabinet Office and the Home Office, it was sort of tail end of the Blair era and then Gordon Brown, and the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit had a very big impact on the way that government thought about delivery chains. Everyone was mapping their delivery chain, and you'd set a target and then you'd collect lots of information and so on. And by the end of it, there was certainly in the Home Office, there was a unit called the Police Standards Unit that used to track performance of every police force and would look at kind of most similar forces and who was problematic and who wasn't. And Theresa May arrived in the Home Office in 2010 and just abolished the whole lot and said, this is not for government to do, this is for local areas to do. Why is the Home Office keeping a track of all these different forces that are up and down? And this should be something that the local area does. And then established police and crime commissioners who set that plan locally. Now, I think you can debate whether police and crime commissioners are a useful addition or not to the local landscape. But one thing I do think they do is they enable intelligent local prioritisation to happen. And it means that the Home Office isn't meddling around with whether burglary clear-up rates are working in one space or another, when actually the local area is really caring about knife crime, say. So I think I would give that as another example, which I think was a good move.
Thank you. So we've had a 3-year comprehensive spending review that was at the end of last year, and we're now starting to see some fresh policy papers coming out, like the Levelling Up White Paper. So we will start to see central government programs emerging now, after a hiatus of a number of years, mostly because of the pandemic. So what tips do you think we can give to central government civil servants who've been tasked with designing these programs, and particularly ones that will require close involvement and cooperation with councils?
So and this question that's in the chat, which is, at what point does devolution become the relinquishing of responsibility, and how do you gain the balance? So the phrase I've got going through my head is "you do you." So I think in these policy papers, central government needs to do the things that need to happen at scale, and needs to attend to the systemic stuff that central government can influence. And then it needs to give room for local government to do the things that they need to do. So if you take the example of the health disparities white paper, which the Department of Health is working up at the moment. I don't know if they're doing a white paper. Anyway, they're doing a load of thinking about health disparities. There are things, if I think about food and obesity, for instance, which are about the behaviour of the food industry on advertising and so on, which no local authority is going to be able to get on top of on their own. That central government can do something at that scale with those national actors to make a difference. Another example in my space would be the role of delivery companies like Deliveroo and Uber Eats and Just Eat. They are a platform that's operating at national scale, which all of the local takeaways go onto. Now, it's easier for the FSA to have a single conversation with Just Eat about what they're doing on their food hygiene ratings than it is for lots of local authorities to do that. So I would say that the advice I would give to someone in central government is, you do you. Like, let's us do the things that are about the system, about upstream, about shaping the environment, and then make sure we're not kind of going around with our long screwdrivers trying to solve the thing locally, when actually people locally know that better.
Thank you. John, do you want to add anything on that, or?
Yeah, I would say if I was designing a central government program, I think you absolutely need to consciously think about the skills of a bridge builder and the role of a bridge builder in that program, and who does that, and how you do that. If you commission it from elsewhere, if you do it yourself, that's another question. But there needs to be someone who can do that translation process, who can build that trust, who has the understanding. And it's not obviously not as simple as local central government having a political policy priority and just saying to local government, please do it.
Indeed.
Can I come in on the question that's in the chat, the one that says, sorry for such a negative question, but it's the feeling out in the public. Can I comment on that? Would that be
of course you can, yes.
So this point, which is, the Eric Pickles destroyed relationships, and then the behaviours of government and civil servants have insulted this government standing in the world. And I presume that's referring to what's happened with the parties in Downing Street and so on. I just want to say, really, if you care about relationships, you have to recognise that there are individuals at the end of the bridge who aren't just the institution in the round, they're people and they're individuals. So, there are plenty of people in my organisation who feel very sickened by what happened in Downing Street and were quite shocked actually about some of the behaviours that have come out, and who feel quite upset about their standing as civil servants because that's affected them. And I think the other thing that I try and remember when I'm finding myself in conflict with someone from a different part of government or a different part of the public sector is that people tend to behave rationally in their own context. So my job is to try and find out why they are behaving, how they're behaving. They're not doing it usually to thwart me deliberately or to be difficult. They're doing it because their own context means that they have to behave like this. So there's something that I haven't yet understood. I think if you over-identify an entire institution with one person, like Eric Pickles or some people at Downing Street, you're missing the heterogeneity of what's going on in government or in local government. You think about your colleagues and how much they differ to each other. So if we're good at relationship building, we have to be good at appreciating that heterogeneity and really inquiring into what's going on for people as individuals.
No, I think that's a really thoughtful answer, Emily. Thank you. Time for one more question. We're going to take Tom Saps's question from the end of the question thing here. What intervention, and this links back to something you were asking earlier, John, what interventions do you think would help those in central government gain better understanding of local government? Are there any initiatives that you feel would help with this? I think the answer is undoubtedly yes, but John, just 1 minute, if you would.
I'll make two really quick comments. Yeah. I think central government can explicitly seek to hire people from local government, and maybe vice versa. And I think, so some of the big companies have something called back to the floor, which is where somebody in head office always spends 2 weeks every 3 years or something working on the front line. How about something like that? Brilliant.
Thank you very much. Emily, final thought from you?
So I basically just please invite us along. So I'd make an effort to do visits in the way that you're describing, John, and every time I spend time out of the office and in a local context, I get a huge amount of insight. It's fantastic. I've also just been on a leadership course, which has been for chief executives in the public sector, where I've been the only central government person. I've mostly been chief execs of local authorities and chief fire officers and heads of multi-academy trusts and so on, which is run through the National Leadership Centre, which for me has been one of the best examples in my 22 years of getting some bridge building happening between those functions. And then the other thing I'd say is that you don't have to do it as a live visit. Certainly through the pandemic, we had some virtual visits. So I went to Hull for 3 hours with some people from Hull, with a load of other senior leaders from government, where we talked through all sorts of aspects. So these are things that are possible to try and get interaction and learning happening.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I mean, my idea, I would certainly like to see a lot of training in this, because there are technical things to learn as well as relationship building. So Emily, John and Paul as well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you everybody listening, and I will send out a follow-up email with the slides, with the report, and I thank everyone for their time, and have a really good rest of your day. Thank you.